I'm going to be talking to economist Michael Bernstein, who is the ex-executive director of Clean Prosperity, about some comments that he's made recently about the oil and gas emissions cap from the federal government and concerns that he has. So welcome to the interview, Michael.
Thanks, Markham.
Now, I have to tell you, Energy Media's editorial position on this is that the proposals in the recent discussion paper proposing either cap and trade system or to increase the carbon price for oil and gas in Canada, I think, in fact, doesn't go far enough. You think it goes too far. So we're going to have an interesting conversation today. But please explain, what is your argument that it went too far and shouldn't have singled out oil and gas?
Yeah, I think my concern is mostly the latter, that it singles out oil and gas, and not necessarily that it's going too far. I mean, I certainly agree that we need to have meaningful reductions in emissions by 2030. We obviously have to set ourselves up for net zero. There's no question there. But I think the thing I'm struggling with is, why would we separate out oil and gas, or for that matter, any industry, from other industrial sectors? That's concern number one. And the second concern is, if this is really meant to achieve reductions for 2030, then we need to be relying on our existing systems so that we can get emissions reductions in the near term, because 2030 is 7.5 years away. So I'd say those are two of my biggest concerns. I have a few other nits, but why don't I leave it there for now?
Well, I'm going to give you an argument that the feds might have used when they were putting this discussion paper together. And basically, I have three things, but the basic argument is that the oil and gas shot itself in the foot. They've done this through their own inaction over the years, and I'll give you some examples. So for starters, if you look through their investor presentations, they are not prioritizing decarbonization. They're prioritizing the bulk of their free cash flow to dividends and share buybacks. They have lots of money, billions and billions of dollars in free cash flow that they could invest in decarbonization, and they're not. They're giving it back. So that's number one. They've sent a clear signal to Ottawa, to the federal government, that decarbonization is not a priority. Two, they've been working on this, on new technologies around this for years and years, and long before the federal government came out with a climate policy, and the current government, and solvent substitution would be one. And they have dragged their feet and not implemented it at scale when they could have, and so they had that opportunity missed. And thirdly, in Alberta in particular, TIER, which is the Industrial Emitter Program, actually diluted the impact on oil and gas, and the oil sands in particular, by at least a third, according to Andrew Leach, when the UCP government took over and modified the NDP's CCR program. And so basically now, under that system, the industry gets like 80-90% discounts and pays maybe $1 or $1.50, $2 a barrel in carbon pricing. So it's not even they don't even worry about it. It's just a rounding error for them. So all of those together, and I can see the federal government just said, they're not ever going to move. They're not ever going to do anything. We have to get their attention. We have to get them to move. Here you go, gentlemen.
So I would agree that it is concerning that the oil and gas sector hasn't invested or prioritized decarbonization. And I certainly think that is a signal that we need more policy to ensure that those companies and those leaders have the right incentives to put that money in decarbonization instead of sending it back to shareholders. So we're aligned on that part. My concern is, what are the right policies to put in place now? And I would argue that the right policy is a combination of strengthening the existing carbon pricing system and giving the federal government the flexibility to increase those carbon prices if needed. So maybe just to be even clearer, Markham, with you, I'd say there's 4 specific things that need to be done, in my view. Right? The first thing is, we need to increase the share of emissions that are being charged a carbon price under industrial pricing systems like TIER. Today, it's under 20%. It needs to go up by a significant percentage each and every year. Right? That's number one. The second thing is the federal government should be providing greater certainty to oil and gas and other industry that the price schedule is actually going to be realized, because there is some risk that if governments change, they may, again, yo-yo on policy and put in place a different system. So there's a solution to that called contracts for difference. I won't go into the details now, but it essentially gives, it's like an insurance product to give businesses the confidence that they're going to see that $170 price realized. The third thing is we need to have, the government should be giving itself the flexibility to raise carbon prices even further beyond the 170. If we see in 2026 or 2027, there's not enough action, let's keep raising that price as that incentive that these companies need to decarbonize. And the last piece is a border carbon adjustment that protects the competitiveness, because there are some legitimate concerns that the companies have. So to me, that would form a logical and more effective approach than the policies on offer. But we are aligned on the idea that we need more policy.
Okay, well, let's talk about the carbon leakage issue, which is where you come, why we get the discounts on the tier program, for example. So the argument is that if you increase costs too much on the carbon cost too much on a producer, it will just simply pick up and move to another jurisdiction. I've never understood why that applied to the oil sands. The oil sands ain't picking up and going anywhere. They're stuck. And it doesn't matter if you add that cost, the additional cost, you know, they're not going to move. So, and this plays into the carbon border adjustment problem, is because it has to be negotiated between Canada and the US. And so, I mean, that could happen next year with Biden. It could happen. It might not ever happen.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
so
very, sorry to interrupt, Markham. I agree with you that it is complex and not something that's going to happen in the next year or two. But what I do think is, as more and more emissions are charged a carbon price, whether it be the oil sands, whether it be in the steel industry, we are going to see concerns, because that will lead to increases in the costs for those goods that competitors in other countries aren't facing. So do the oil sands need a border carbon adjustment next year? Probably not. But at some point, there will be concerns that that oil will be priced too high to allow it to be competitive against other products. And we need real analysis and numbers to figure out when that is. Maybe it isn't in the next 5 years. I don't have those numbers at my disposal, but I do know that my recommendation is, let's increase the share of emissions and let's allow trading across industries, because a megaton of emissions avoided is great for the climate, no matter where it comes from. It doesn't really matter. But let's also be mindful of the competitiveness concerns.
Now, I want to raise another argument here, because you and I have dealt with this a little bit in previous interviews, but that's the argument made by people like Dr. Danny Cullenwood in his climate policy book last year, which is that carbon pricing has never reduced emissions anywhere. Basically, it has to be a combination of carbon pricing and industrial policy. And if you look at the actions of the individual producers, and the reason I bring this up is because Suncor is the only oil and gas company, the only oil sands company that has a plan to reduce emissions between now and 2030. And they're going to bring it down by 10 megatons, from 29 megatons a year to 19 megatons. And they've got, you know, cogeneration. They're going to switch over from petcoke to natural gas, and they've got solvent substitution. They're actually doing something. And if Suncor can lower emissions, then there's no reason why the other oil sands companies can't do it. And they're saying, our hands are tied until 2030. And I'm saying we need some sticks. And I think Canadians are tired of this foot dragging and complaining and asking government to bear all the cost of the decarbonization, or 2/3 of it in the case of the oil sands. And the federal government, I would bet money, has basically said, okay, we've been letting you off the hook. We've been giving you carrots, and now it's time. We need some bigger sticks.
And I guess my point would be, what are the right sticks? We do need sticks. I mean, you need a combination ultimately of carrots and sticks, but I think right now the focus should be on sticks. And I think that the right way to do that is to do that in a way that doesn't unnecessarily increase costs across industrial decarbonization. We've got to get emissions down in the oil sands. We also have to get them down in our steel sector, and for our cement sector, and our chemical sector, and our mining. So let's put in place a policy that can do all of that. Increase the emissions that are charged. That's a stick. Okay. But allow them to trade across each other in a way that is most efficient, and keep ratcheting up that pressure and those sticks if you're not seeing enough results year over year.
But isn't that essentially the second option that the federal government put into its emission reduction plan discussion paper?
Unfortunately not. It has some similarities to it, but that second proposal is to still carve out the oil and gas sector into its own sandbox within the industrial pricing system, and say we're going to increase the price only on oil and gas. We're not going to allow trading across the output-based pricing system. I'm not even sure how they're going to do that, because today it's one integrated system. And furthermore, which was a surprise to me, they said none of these changes will come into force until 2027, which is 3 years from when we've got to see this emissions reduction. I mean, it's just, we're already behind, but to wait till 2027, I think makes it nearly impossible to imagine that will achieve real reductions. So I think needs to be some adjustments to that second option.
Okay, fair enough. And I would agree with you on the 2027. I mean, the prime minister at one point promised that the emissions cap would come on by 2025, and there would be annual increments, incremental declines by regular increments annually.
Right.
So that, yeah, I get that. So what, aside from this idea of the forward contracts, what else can they do?
Yeah, and Markham, let me just mention one more thing about that, if you don't mind, and then I will absolutely talk to what they can do. But I've said my concerns about the second option. The first option, which is a cap and trade system, one of the concerns I have there is cap and trade systems typically don't have a purely hard cap. What you find in those systems, whether you look at Europe, you look at California, is that when the price gets too high too fast, you have additional credits being put out into the system by governments. And the federal government says in their discussion paper, effectively, they're not going to do that. I mean, they said it a little differently, but the net effect is they're not going to do that. But we've never seen that before in reality. So my concern is, if prices start to get up to $300, $400, $500 a ton because of the nature of the cap and the little time we have, I find it hard to believe they're not just going to provide some relief escape valve, let's call it. And then what have you done? You don't have a hard cap. You've put in place a whole new system. It's taken a bunch of years to implement. It's increased the administrative burden on these companies, including smaller companies. It just doesn't seem practical to me. So to get to your question, what I would do is I would keep the existing system, and I would essentially do the 4 things I said earlier, which is keep increasing the share of emissions that get charged year over year. Today, it's only about a 1% increase every year. I'd like to see that go to 3, 4, even 5% a year. Give yourself the flexibility to continue to raise the actual price if you're not seeing reductions. Provide some insurance to companies to guarantee, hey, that price is going to be there. Even if there's a change of government, they're not taking that price away. You have that in a contract. You can bank on that. And lastly, do something on the competitiveness. To me, a package like that would get you the reductions you need. It would be stick driven, as you say. And I think it would be able to be implemented much more quickly than either of the options we see the government proposing.
Okay, the first objection that I can see to that suggestion, Michael, is in fact that those like TIER in Alberta, the program in Saskatchewan, any place where you're producing oil and gas are not controlled by governments who are anti-carbon pricing. They only have what they have because the federal government bullied them into doing it, basically, and made them sign equivalency agreements. And I can't see the UCP government in Alberta, which is really, I mean, far and away, Alberta is the big problem here. It's 75% of oil and gas emissions in Canada. And I can't see the Alberta government ceding to federal pressure to dramatically ramp up the industrial emitter carbon price on oil and gas company with anybody in any of the emitters in Alberta.
Well, look, the Alberta government is proposing in a discussion paper that they're going to increase the ramp up from 1% to 2% a year, which is something. It's not a huge amount, but it is something. And it's partially because, to your point, the federal government has put out some new criteria for what they are going to allow provinces to do over the 2023 to 2030 period. So the federal government certainly has the ability to continue to make those rules even stricter. And it would involve a change from what they said earlier this year, but so would putting in place a new cap and trade system, or so would changing the pricing system in the way they've described in this discussion paper. So my argument to the federal government is you're going to be making changes to your pricing systems no matter what, if you're serious about capping oil and gas emissions. So why not make different changes? And why not have those changes be that you're going to require the provinces, even if they don't feel like it, to your point, to increase the share of emissions by a specified period each and every year, or there are some other kind of creative ways you could do it as well, but it effectively leads to that same result.
Okay, well, the things we agree on, Michael, are that there needs to be more sticks and it needs to be in a shorter period, and we need to get serious about this. And I'm less optimistic than you, because I think that the Alberta government is foot dragging, as is the industry, and their public comments, I think, support that argument. But nevertheless, I think we've got a little clarity in this conversation about what the options are. And I guess we'll see what happens in the consultations that happen around the discussion paper. So
yeah,
always appreciate your insights. Oh, yeah.
I appreciate that, Markham. And let me just quickly say that even if we're different on the pessimism, and I'm not even sure if we are, I think the question now is just what are the right sticks to put in place, and how do we get emissions reductions quickly and cost effectively? So look, I appreciated the discussion, and I'm sure we'll talk about this again sometime soon.
We will. And I would argue, just on the closing point, just to tie a bow around this conversation, that it needs to be a really big stick with a nail in the end of it.
All right.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Markham. Take care.